Every Tuesday morning, my trash can ended up on its side. Garbage spilled across my driveway like a warning. At first, I thought it was kids. Then the notes started. Then the fines. Someone in my neighborhood was watching my house closely enough to know my schedule, my habits, even when I wasn't home. And the HOA kept claiming it was just coincidence. But the knocking over didn't stop. It escalated. That's when I realized this wasn't about trash at all. It was about control. And when I finally installed something they never noticed, everything changed. The question is, who really crossed the line first? Before any of it started, life in the neighborhood was quiet in the way people move to planned communities hoping it will stay forever. The streets were clean, the lawns trimmed to the same careful height, and the houses looked different only if you paid close attention. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen, and that was exactly the appeal that I had lived there long enough to fall into a rhythm. Trash day was automatic. Roll the bin out the night before, pull it back in after work, forget about it until next week. Mornings were predictable. Coffee on the porch, a quick glance at the driveway, then off to work. Evenings were calm. No loud parties. No confrontations. Just a quiet sense that everyone knew the rules and followed them without thinking too hard. The HOA liked to present itself as invisible. That was the promise printed in the welcome packet. They handled maintenance, kept property values high, and stepped in only when absolutely necessary. Most residents barely noticed them unless a reminder email landed in the inbox about holiday decorations or lawn edging. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't volunteer. I stayed out of the way, assuming that was all it took to remain unnoticed. For a while, that assumption held true. The neighborhood had its personalities, of course. There were people who measured their grass with almost professional dedication. People who peeked through blinds when unfamiliar cars parked on the street. People who treated the HOA guidelines less like suggestions and more like a personal mission. But those types existed everywhere. They were background noise, not threats at least. That's what I thought. The first hint that something was off was subtle enough to ignore. One morning, the trash can wasn't where I left it. It was lying on its side, lid open, contents scattered just enough to be annoying. I cleaned it up, muttered about animals or the wind, and went on with my day. It felt too small to matter, too random to question. Then it happened again. Same day of the week. Same placement. Same mess. This time, it felt deliberate, but still explainable. I told myself it was coincidence. Trash trucks were careless sometimes. Maybe someone clipped it while pulling out of their driveway. It was easier to believe that than to imagine someone cared enough to interfere. But the pattern kept forming. Each week, the disruption grew slightly worse. The can rolled farther. The spill spread wider. And somewhere in the middle of all that routine chaos, the HOA emails began to change. The language grew sharper. The reminders more specific. Improper bin storage. Unsightly waste exposure. Community standards, nothing outright accusatory. Just enough to feel pointed. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How some neighbors seemed unusually aware of everyone else's habits. How quickly minor issues were reported. How often the same house lights were on, even late at night, facing the street. The neighborhood still looked calm, but underneath that surface was an undercurrent of quiet surveillance. What unsettled me most wasn't the trash can. It was the timing. The incidents always happened when I wasn't home. Always just early enough in the morning to cause inconvenience. Never late enough to be seen. Whoever was doing it knew the schedule, knew the rules, knew exactly how far they could push without being caught on the spot, and the HOA's response never matched the situation. There were no questions, no investigations, just notices, warnings, a steady implication that the problem originated with me, regardless of how little sense that made. That was when I realized the neighborhood wasn't as passive as it pretended to be. Something small had been allowed to fester. A petty irritation, a quiet judgment, a need to enforce order where none was actually broken. And whatever rule or grievance was coming next, it was already in motion long before I understood I was part of it. The trash can was just the first sign that someone had decided I needed correcting. Since slowly transformed into something heavier, something that followed me even when I tried not to think about it. The trash can incidents didn't just continue, they evolved. The spills became messier. Bags were torn open. Loose debris ended up farther from the curb, closer to the driveway, closer to the front of the house. And every single time, the HOA notices arrived with unsettling precision. At first, the fines were small, barely noticeable amounts that felt more symbolic than punitive. A warning here, a courtesy notice there. The language was always polite, always passive, always framed as a reminder of community standards rather than an accusation. But the timing was impossible to ignore. A knocked-over bin in the morning, an email by afternoon. It was as if someone was watching in real time, waiting for the moment the mess appeared so it could be reported. I started documenting everything. Dates, photos, timestamps. I noted the weather conditions, the placement of the bin, how far it had rolled. I convinced myself that logic would matter, that evidence would matter. If I could show a pattern, the HOA would have to acknowledge that something external was happening. Instead, the responses grew colder. The notices stopped mentioning possible violations and started stating them as facts. Improper trash containment, failure to maintain cleanliness, repeated noncompliance. Each message carried the same undertone. Responsibility rested with the homeowner, regardless of cause. It didn't matter how the trash ended up on the ground. It only mattered that it was there. That's when I began to feel the pressure beyond the driveway. Neighbors who once waved casually now looked away. A few stared longer than necessary. Conversations stopped when I approached. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The HOA notices weren't just enforcement tools, they were narratives, quietly shaping how others viewed me, turning an invisible problem into a reputational one. The rules themselves began to shift, or at least that's how it felt. Guidelines I'd skimmed years ago suddenly became weapons. Trash bins could only be out for a narrow window of time. Lids had to be fully closed at all moments. Containers had to remain upright and flush against the curb. Any deviation, regardless of cause, constituted a violation. The rules didn't account for reality. They didn't account for interference. They assumed control where there was none. The fines escalated. What once felt like an annoyance now carried weight. Each new charge stacked onto the last, accompanied by warnings about continued noncompliance. The threat of additional penalties loomed, vague but unmistakable. The HOA wasn't just correcting behavior anymore. It was building leverage. I reached out formally, submitting my documentation and explaining the pattern. I emphasized that the bin was being moved, not neglected. That something or someone was actively causing the issue. The response came days later, carefully worded and dismissive. Responsibility for securing trash containers rested solely with the homeowner. External factors were irrelevant. Future violations would be enforced accordingly. It was then that frustration turned into something sharper. I began altering my routine. I woke earlier on trash days. I positioned the bin differently. I added weight. I checked the driveway before leaving, sometimes twice. For a brief moment, it seemed like it might work. 1 week passed without incident. Then another. And then, suddenly, it got worse. The trash wasn't just knocked over anymore. The bin was dragged, left halfway up the driveway. Once, it was placed deliberately in the middle of the concrete, as if to make sure it was impossible to miss. The intent was unmistakable now. This wasn't accidental. It was performative, and the HOA reacted exactly as before. Another fine, another notice, another reminder that repeated violations demonstrated a lack of respect for community standards. No mention of my reports. No acknowledgement of the escalating interference. Just enforcement, steady and relentless. The sense of being targeted settled in. I started noticing patterns in the neighborhood. Certain houses never received notices, no matter how visible their violations were. Decorations left up too long. Bins out past the allowed window. Vehicles parked slightly off guideline. The rules were flexible, selectively so. Enforcement wasn't about order. It was about attention, and someone had decided I deserved it. The more I pushed back, the more resistance I met. My emails went unanswered longer. My reports were acknowledged without action. The fines continued to accrue, each one framed as the result of my own failure to comply. It felt like arguing with a system designed to exhaust rather than resolve. What made it worse was the silence around it. No direct confrontation. No explanation. Just the steady drip of consequences. Whoever was responsible didn't need to say anything. The HOA was doing the work for them. The pressure extended beyond trash day. Suddenly, other minor issues surfaced. A reminder about driveway appearance. A notice about exterior maintenance. Nothing outright false, but all suspiciously timed. It was as if once attention had been directed my way, everything I did was now subject to scrutiny. The neighborhood that once felt neutral now felt hostile. Each week carried a sense of anticipation, not knowing how far the interference would go next. I found myself scanning the driveway before bed, checking cameras I'd never thought I'd need, adjusting habits around a problem that refused to be addressed at its source. And still, the HOA maintained its stance. The fines reached a point where they could no longer be ignored. Notices hinted at further action if the pattern continued. Escalation clauses, administrative reviews, consequences that extended beyond money. The implication was clear. Compliance would be forced if it wasn't given. That was the moment the situation shifted internally. This was no longer about trash cans or petty rules. It was about control, about how easily systems could be weaponized by the most persistent voices, about how silence and procedure could become tools of intimidation, and about how quickly a peaceful routine could be dismantled by someone who understood the rules better than the people enforcing them. I stopped trying to appease the system and started trying to understand it. I read every guideline, every clause, every enforcement provision. I mapped out the language the HOA relied on and the gaps it conveniently ignored. The rules were rigid on outcomes, vague on causes. That vagueness was intentional. It allowed blame to flow in one direction only. And somewhere within that structure, I realized there was an opportunity. But before any plan could take shape, the pressure spiked one last time. One morning, the trash wasn't just disturbed, it was destroyed. Bags torn open completely. Contents spread wider than ever before. It was impossible to clean quickly, impossible to hide. And within hours, the most severe notice yet arrived. Final warning language. Escalation mentioned outright that IT was the clearest signal, yet that the situation was reaching a breaking point. Someone believed they had won. They believed the rules, the fines, and the silence had cornered me. That compliance or collapse were the only options left. That whatever line they were pushing toward, I would eventually cross it under pressure. What they didn't realize was that by pushing this far, they had finally made the interference visible enough to anticipate and predictable enough to plan around. And while the HOA continued enforcing what it could see, it remained completely unaware of what it couldn't. Because the next step wasn't about responding. It was about letting the system reveal itself and setting the stage for something it never thought to look for. The breaking point arrived quietly, disguised as routine. Trash day came and went like it always did, except this time the aftermath was worse than anything before it. The bin wasn't just tipped or dragged. It had been overturned with force, its contents scattered so widely that it looked intentional, theatrical. Loose trash clung to the edges of the driveway, spilled toward the sidewalk, and lingered just long enough to be documented. It was impossible to miss, impossible to excuse. The HOA response was immediate. This notice was different. The tone had shifted from corrective to punitive. The language was heavier, sharper, final. It referenced repeated violations, escalating fines, and impending enforcement actions if compliance failed to improve. There was no ambiguity left, no room for explanation. The assumption was absolute. I was the problem, and the patience had run out. For the first time since this began, I felt the weight of it fully settle in. Not anger, not frustration, pressure. This was the moment the system intended to break me. The moment designed to force surrender through exhaustion, fear, and inevitability. The HOA wasn't asking anymore. It was asserting authority, confident that procedure would finish what harassment had started, and that confidence was exactly what made the timing perfect. Because while the HOA had been watching my driveway, documenting messes and issuing penalties, it had missed the quiet changes happening around the problem. It had ignored patterns in favor of outcomes. It had focused on visible disorder while overlooking the cause entirely. The interference had become predictable, the timing, the placement, the escalation. Every detail followed a rhythm, one that only made sense if someone nearby was actively involved. Someone who understood the rules well enough to exploit them. Someone who knew exactly how much disruption would trigger enforcement without crossing into outright exposure. That predictability had become my leverage. Instead of reacting to the latest notice, I let it sit. I didn't rush to clean. I didn't appeal. I didn't respond. I let the mess remain just long enough to ensure it would be seen, documented, and escalated exactly as expected. The HOA did the rest without hesitation. The next step came faster than I anticipated. An administrative review was triggered. The process was formal, procedural, and framed as unavoidable. Continued noncompliance, they said, would result in further action. The implication was clear. Fines were no longer the ceiling. Consequences were expanding. It felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. But that was exactly where the turning point lived. Because this time, the attention wasn't just on me. The interference happened again, right on schedule. Same morning, same placement, same aggressive mess. But this time, the environment around it had changed. The context was different. The conditions were no longer invisible. The system had been allowed to escalate long enough to expose itself. When the HOA moved to formalize its enforcement, it unknowingly stepped into a situation it had never prepared for. One where assumptions replaced verification, where responsibility was assigned without investigation, where consistency mattered more than convenience. And suddenly, the narrative cracked. The documentation I'd been collecting for weeks wasn't emotional. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't framed as a complaint. It was chronological, pattern-based, and uncomfortably precise. It didn't argue. It showed the frequency of incidents, the timing relative to enforcement notices, the escalation curve, the selective application of rules, the absence of corrective action despite repeated reports of interference. Every detail pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. Enforcement was being triggered by manipulation, not negligence. And once that conclusion surfaced, it didn't stay contained. The review process brought eyes that hadn't been watching before. People who cared less about preserving authority and more about avoiding liability. People who recognized that rules without context weren't just unfair, they were dangerous. The tone shifted again. Suddenly, questions appeared where certainty had lived. Requests replaced warnings. Language softened. The same system that had seemed immovable days earlier now hesitated. Procedures slowed. Decisions paused. The HOA had reached the moment it feared most, scrutiny. And the person responsible for triggering the entire mess hadn't anticipated it. Because interference thrives in silence, in assumptions, in routines that go unquestioned. It relies on enforcement happening automatically, without curiosity or resistance. The moment that automation breaks, the behavior behind it becomes visible. And visibility changes everything. The pattern no longer looked like noncompliance. It looked like provocation. The trash incidents, once dismissed as homeowner negligence, began to resemble targeted disruption. The consistency stopped looking coincidental. The timing stopped making sense. The rules that had been used so confidently now worked in reverse, demanding explanations that no one wanted to give. The HOA had enforced itself into a corner. The peak of the conflict wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a meeting or a confrontation. It happened in the uncomfortable realization that the system had failed to protect itself from being used as a weapon. And once that realization took hold, the power balance shifted. The enforcement paused. The fines stopped accumulating. The language changed again, this time cautious and neutral. Responsibility was no longer assumed. The process was under review. The situation was being evaluated. The same HOA that once acted with certainty now refused to act at all. And the interference stopped. Not gradually, not tentatively, immediately. No more overturned bins. No more scattered debris. No more calculated messes designed to trigger consequences. The silence that followed was louder than anything before it. It confirmed what logic already had. The behavior had never been random. It had only existed while it served its purpose. That was the true climax. Not a confrontation, but an exposure. Not revenge, but consequence. The realization that control built on procedure collapses the moment someone forces it to explain itself. That authority enforced without context cannot survive attention. That systems designed to be efficient are dangerously vulnerable to those who understand them too well. And as the neighborhood settled back into its manufactured calm, one truth lingered beneath the surface. The HOA had tried to break me quietly. Instead, it had revealed exactly how fragile its power really was. The only question left was what would happen once the consequences fully caught up, not just for the system, but for the person who believed they could hide behind it. The aftermath didn't arrive with an announcement. There was no apology letter, no dramatic admission of fault, no public reckoning that neatly tied everything together. Instead, the resolution unfolded the way most real consequences do, quietly, methodically, and in ways that mattered far more than any single confrontation ever could. The HOA's enforcement remained suspended longer than expected. Weeks passed without new notices. The outstanding fines stopped appearing on statements. The language used in emails shifted from authoritative to procedural, carefully stripped of assumptions. What once felt like an unmovable force now behaved like an organization suddenly aware of its own exposure. The trash can stayed upright. Week after week, it sat exactly where it was supposed to, untouched. No tipping, no dragging, no mess staged to trigger another violation. The predictability that once fueled the harassment had vanished entirely, replaced by an almost deliberate normalcy. The absence of disruption confirmed everything that had been implied. The interference had only existed as long as the system rewarded it. The neighborhood changed too, though not in obvious ways. The stares softened. Conversations resumed. The quiet tension that had followed me through the streets eased, replaced by something closer to neutrality. People stopped looking away. A few even nodded again. The narrative that had been allowed to form, the careless homeowner, the repeat offender, slowly dissolved when there was nothing left to reinforce it. Silence, it turned out, was corrective. The HOA never admitted wrongdoing, but its behavior told a clearer story than words ever could. Policies were quietly clarified. Enforcement language was revised. References to automatic responsibility were softened to include investigation and context. The same rules still existed, but the way they were applied changed just enough to signal caution. Someone, somewhere within the structure, had realized how close things had come to going very wrong. And while the HOA tried to preserve its image, consequences still found their way through the cracks. The pattern that had been exposed couldn't be unseen. Once scrutiny entered the system, it didn't leave easily. Other residents began to notice inconsistencies they'd previously ignored. Questions surfaced during meetings. Enforcement decisions were challenged. The assumption that the HOA always acted fairly lost its grip. Authority, once questioned, never fully recovers its original shape. As for the person who had started it all, the disappearance was almost complete. Whatever role they had played, whatever confidence they'd drawn from anonymity and procedure, evaporated the moment the system stopped responding to their provocations. Without automatic enforcement to amplify their actions, there was nothing left to lean on. No more disturbances. No more pressure. Just absence. That absence spoke volumes. It became clear that the situation had never been about trash cans or community standards. It had been about power, small, localized, deeply personal power. The kind that thrives in environments where rules are rigid and oversight is shallow, where procedure replaces judgment and silence protects manipulation. Once that dynamic was disrupted, it collapsed entirely. Life returned to its rhythm, but not the same one that existed before. There was a new awareness now, one that lingered beneath everyday routines. Trash day still came and went. The bin still rolled out and back in. But the blind trust in systems was gone, replaced by something steadier and more grounded. Understanding. The experience changed how I viewed compliance. I stopped assuming that following rules automatically protected me. I stopped believing that organizations always acted impartially just because they claimed to. I learned that systems don't correct themselves. They respond to pressure, documentation, and attention. Most importantly, I learned that patience can be strategic. The instinct to react immediately, to defend loudly, to confront directly, all of that had felt justified in the moment. But restraint had proven more effective. Letting the system escalate itself had revealed its flaws far more clearly than resistance ever could. The outcome wasn't revenge. It was insulation. From that point forward, interactions with the HOA were measured and careful. Communication stayed documented. Requests stayed written. The relationship was no longer casual, but it was functional. Boundaries existed where none had before, and those boundaries were respected precisely because they were defined. The neighborhood returned to its polished calm, but beneath it ran a subtle shift in tone. People were more observant, less quick to assume fault, more willing to ask questions. The unspoken understanding that rules could be misused settled into collective awareness. And that understanding mattered. Because situations like this don't happen in isolation. They happen wherever rigid systems meet human pettiness, wherever authority lacks accountability, wherever procedure is trusted blindly. The trash can had been a symbol, a vulnerability, of how easily someone could be targeted without ever being confronted directly. But it also became proof of something else, that even the smallest, pettiest acts can expose much larger problems when they're allowed to run long enough. The long-term impact wasn't dramatic, but it was lasting. The HOA became quieter. Enforcement slowed. Decisions became more cautious. The community became slightly less polished, slightly less perfect, and far more honest because of it. And the lesson carried beyond the neighborhood. Systems are only as fair as the people watching them. Rules are only as just as the context they allow. And power, when exercised without scrutiny, always leaves fingerprints, even when it believes it's invisible. In the end, nothing exploded. Nothing burned down. No one stood victorious in public view. But the pressure lifted. The targeting ended. The balance corrected itself. And every Tuesday morning, when the trash can remains upright and untouched, it serves as a quiet reminder of what happens when control is challenged not with noise, but with clarity, because sometimes the most satisfying resolution isn't winning loudly. It's watching something that tried to dominate you lose its grip, and knowing it can never use the same tricks again. The question is, how many people live under similar systems, mistaking silence for fairness, and never realize how close they are to becoming the next quiet target? If this story hit a little too close to home, you're not alone. Situations like this happen every day in quiet neighborhoods where rules are enforced without context and power hides behind procedure. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that crossed the line, or a neighbor who used the system to control instead of protect, your story matters too. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in this situation, or if you've lived through something similar. Don't forget to like the video if this story kept you hooked, and subscribe to HOA Prime Stories for more real, suspenseful HOA and neighborhood disputes you won't hear anywhere else. Because sometimes the calmest streets hide the darkest power games, and here, we expose them.